Right, Tim, we're going to pick your brain. And unfortunately, we're going to pick it with brand new questions. So prepare to be guinea pigged, my friend.
Like they do, fresh scalpels. That's good.
Oh, no, we keep the scalpels. Are you meant to change those? I'm going to lose my license. So, Tim, what is the first story you wrote which meant something to you?
That's quite, it surprised me that there is a very easy answer that springs to mind for that.
Cool.
It was a story written as a kid. I'm going to say age 10, and it was fan fiction. It was Doctor Who fan fiction.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, but it was wholehearted. I think before that I must have, you write stories at school. That's fine, and I would always look forward to that. And I would be frustrated when teachers didn't ask for stories. It was almost like, what's the point? Especially with a prompt, like with this podcast. Having a prompt and then feeling the wheels turning in the mind was what I loved. But yeah, so I remember I wrote from start to finish a proper story, which was fan fiction about the Doctor Who episode called Silver Nemesis, which was with the Cybermen.
Yeah.
Sylvester McCoy episode in 1988. And I remember loving the act of writing, and I went to town with it because I was also very much into magazines at the time. I printed it out. I made a front cover, and my parents, one of them, photocopied it at work, and I made and sold a magazine that I sold to my teachers.
Holy crap! You extorted them for money.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I definitely sold it to one friend who still has a copy.
Nice.
I'm not sure any other of my peers fell for the bait. But I do remember fleecing a few teachers. So good result, I think.
So you've been a paid author since you were 10 years old.
Right.
What a solid answer.
You said that on here now. The BBC are fucking coming for you.
That's true. Yeah, actually, you say that. Copyright plagiarism is obviously my trigger point, because before that point, the only clear memory I do have of writing was when my mum also writes short stories, and she had won a typewriter that was sort of semi-digital. It had like a 10-character display before it started to, print on the paper. Cool. She won it for a story contest. And I loved it so much that I would just write out my favourite stories, which I think were just William stories. So single.
Oh, cool.
And I would just type them from start to finish, because I loved the act of typing as much as more than the act of creating new things.
Your household was drowning in ink debt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely memory though. Love that. So you're actually a second generation writer then?
Yes, it's true. Yeah. So there's definitely, I guess, in terms of writing being a plausible thing to do, then it's a step up, isn't it? To see someone else having done it.
And do you think that's where it comes from for you? The desire to tell stories. It comes from your mum.
Yeah, I don't know. That seems reasonable, but I'm sure, like you both, I bet you were both immersed in books and stories as kids, and books do that to some people, don't they? They you spend your formative years like almost literally sort of immersed in books. Like my bedroom was entirely, I could build walls of books, and dens of books. And it's natural enough for that to come out another way. And it's the best writers, or the most sort of fluent writers, are always huge readers, aren't they? And it just goes without saying, I think.
I think it's a very common aspect of it, for sure, or at least maybe they have read a lot in the past or something. You need to have read in order to know how to write, for certain.
Yeah.
Like it needs to happen. And also, because I find when I'm writing, I'm trying to engender a situation where I'm creating that passion in somebody else.
Yeah.
So you need to know what that passion feels like to be able to aim for it, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think in genre fiction especially, you are kind of sieving a lot of other things. Like everybody plays within it. With if you're writing a science fiction novel or like a Generation Starship story, then you obviously have all of these kind of like touch points that are unavoidable, and they're kind of like popular consciousness. And that's part of the game. It's part of the game is using things that already have been expressed and then riffing on them.
Yeah.
And I think that's vital. I think if you were to take away those influences, and you can't write a Generation Starship novel because the reference points are too abstract. So I'm not sure what point I'm reaching for.
I think I get you though, because it's this idea that you have to build on what has come before, so you have to have read what's come before in order to be
that's right. I think even at a sentence level, you have to have read a huge variety of sentences to understand all of the kind of like very subtle options and the effects that they might evoke.
I know it would be some kind of evil science to do it, but it'd be really cool to like raise someone in an environment where they never got to access any fantasy stuff, and then try to get them to write a fantasy novel, for example. Like, do they come up with their own orc, their own elf, their own swords, and like what would it be in a world with none of those influences?
Creating in a vacuum.
Yeah, it'd be like there's like 1800 sort of experiments to find the universal language. People would be locked newborn children in a room, and then nobody would speak to them until the age of 7, and they would go into the room and expect them to speak God's language, but instead they bark like a dog. And that's the kind of result you get.
Yeah, probably.
We had it all on backwards. We wanted God, we got dog. It's all inverted. They're all walking on the hands.
Mirrors.
Don't do that. We'll open the mirror. So, when it comes to your work, is there for you like a defined starting point where people should jump off if they're going to read you? And when you've picked it, where can I buy it?
God, that is a good question. I'm looking at my website now because my mind goes blank in terms of what it is. I think the honest answer is the one short story collection that I've had published, which is called "And the House Lights Dim." It was published 2 years ago, I think. No longer, 2019. And obviously, a short story collection has more breadth than most novels. It covers different territory. But this one in particular includes the very first stories that I wrote when I started writing seriously, which was in about 2012. And I think almost inevitably the very first stories that I wrote were exactly as we said, the kind of like really riffing on the things that I loved. So you're talking about like inspiring others, but more cynically, it was more like I was synthesizing the things that I had responded to. And so there's a story there that in fact the title story, "The House Lights Dim," it's a John Wyndham story. Really, it's a John Wyndham idea. Do you know John Wyndham, who wrote Day of the Triffids and Midwich Cuckoos?
Oh yeah.
So he was my sort of gateway author from children's fiction, and then Doctor Who novelizations. But then John Wyndham was like it's big science fiction idea and adults, but still very accessible.
It seems like from the conversations we're having that the slightly horror elements in a lot of sci-fi and fantasy stuff is what calls to you.
Yeah, that's definitely the case, and so that collection is definitely a collection of dark speculative fiction, and some of them are science fiction and some of them are other things, but they're definitely all dark in some way. There's like, I guess, ranging from the kind of Tales of the Unexpected kind of last act twist, which I do love, and Roald Dahl was a sort of master of that. but then these very big sort of high concept ideas. So, like John Wyndham was specialised in. So, The House Lights Dim is a story where the entire world has been flooded with light that is blinding. And it's about, it's a post-apocalyptic story of people trying to, in very practical ways, just find their way around, literally, because they can't go out in the house without scarves wrapped around their head. But yeah, so a lot of those stories, retrospectively, I think of as cozy catastrophes, that's what Brian Aldiss, he used that phrase to describe John Wyndham's stories as a criticism. So he felt that stories like Day of the Triffids were kind of absurd because, you have these catastrophes, but then the principal characters sort of trundle on quite happily and they set up a sort of, good life kind of scenario. And although he meant that as a real criticism, if I'm honest, in terms of science fiction, those are the things that I have always responded to, where a massive thing happens, and then we're interested in the mundane, just the real day-to-day repercussions of it.
I really enjoy that aspect, and I really felt you took us there in your mind very well, because I'm now considering just how excellent it is when everything's gone awfully wrong in some way or another, watching humans try and reach that baseline again of like, we need somewhere to sleep, we need something to eat, and once they get those things, you can actually achieve some level of, it's very human to achieve that kind of level of comfort.
Yeah.
Seek normalcy in the abnormal,
and and adjust and adapt very quickly.
But it is also a huge wish fulfillment, and I think even the more bleak post-apocalyptic stories are a sort of wish fulfillment, because even if you're fighting zombies or infected or whatever, the core narrative of those sorts of things is that all of the fiddliness of what we call modern life has been wiped away in one move. There's been a pandemic or whatever. And so you don't have to worry about a double booked meeting at work. And instead you have to worry, have I got a sharp enough blade? So, it's that sort of bringing it back to basics. And I think that the more complex our everyday lives become and frustrating and connected and all those other things, that sort of theoretically are positives, but often feel like the things that you're most frustrated about especially in your working life, then to do away with all of that and say, well, I'm just going to learn how to grow corn. There's like huge appeal there. And I certainly found that I was reading post-apocalyptic novels, like just dozens of them, at a point when I was very, not unhappy, but very unsatisfied with just corporate work, just being in an office. And I didn't have a bad job at all. I worked in educational publishing, but it was just a sense of being on a kind of hamster wheel,
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Right, let's get weird.
That was a real dive. I loved that. It was great. But yeah, let's get weird. I suspect this is going to be Nico's new favourite question, so it's going to be odd.
So, you've been abducted by aliens. Close your eyes, picture the scene. And they offer you a choice. I'm going to have to do it in an alien voice. Either we will probe you, or you must give us a book in order to better understand you. Do you take the probe, or what book are you going to give them?
I'll decline the probe, so we'll start from that point.
No, they always decline the probe.
If I hadn't have used Day of the Triffids, I might that would have been the obvious one, I think. Influences around the age of 10 or 11, I think often seem the most sort of potent. And so I'm going to pick another one that I read around the same time, which is Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency by Douglas Adams.
Okay.
Yeah, which is probably the book that I've read more than any other. Although, I don't think I've read it now for 15 years, and I should. But that's a book that's just rammed with concept, wildness, and it's obviously very funny as well. But I think the idea of exploring so much in terms of like philosophicals of like thought experiments and that sort of thing, with such a light touch, and it being funny, and at a sort of dialogue level, just being so light and frothy. It's not at all a book I could write or would even attempt to write, but it's definitely a book that if I could write it, then I might well stop. I think that would be done.
You'd be done. You've completed writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but there's a book that I adored, and I don't think I was wrong. And you know, a lot of the things you love when you're growing up, you realize you know your tastes change. But I think I was right about that one.
I know, Nico, you're a big fan of Douglas Adams as well.
I am.
It's a big influence for you.
It's really nice to hear you say, talking about how much concept stuff there is. It's really easy to write Adams off just as a comedy writer, but when you like start picking apart his work, there's some really cool high concept sci-fi stuff going on.
Yeah,
It's
sorry.
fascinating.
And it's not just the science fiction stuff that, you know, I remember there's in that book, the main character has created a piece of software that visualizes Word documents and spreadsheets as flight patterns of birds. And it's the kind of thing, I can't think when that book was published, late 80s or mid 80s. It's just like absurd for him to be able to visualize that sort of thing being possible now. Yeah, and it's such a sadness that Douglas Adams didn't live to see, you know, Internet 2.0, Web 2.0.
Yeah.
Bowled over by it.
87, you were spot on, late 80s.
Right.
That means that two things that you've mentioned have been in that period, because the Doctor Who episode was 88 as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And I would be reading those things for the 3 years following it, you know, sort of constantly.
Fascinating. Yeah. What did you make of the Netflix show, the adaptation of it?
I didn't watch it. I saw the BBC one with Stephen Mangan, and it was fine. It was absolutely fine. They did a good job, and Stephen Mangan's brilliant. But it had little of what I loved about the book. Yeah. I think it's the perennially the case with Douglas Adams that it's really his tangents that readers respond to so much. I think that you can sort of feel his interest rising at the point when he no longer has to deliver plot, I think. Yeah. And then you can feel him sort of like stretching back in his chair and just thinking, I think I might just go over here for a bit and think about this other thing that's on my mind.
That's the case with Hitchhikers as well, isn't it? It doesn't really translate well to
it's hard to turn it into anything other than a book, I think.
Yeah. I actually read the first one to my eldest son, who's 9. That was our sort of bedtime book for a while, just recently or last year. And on a plot level, it's pretty. I'm not going to say weak. That's ridiculous, but not much is going on.
Maybe light is the word.
Well, yeah, but it's also very static because it's radio, I suppose. You know, we say it works in written prose, but it's radio really to begin with. Yeah. And so people being in a room talking is absolutely fine. But yeah. But you know, thankfully my son laughed at the gags, so that was the main thing.
There you go. You've successfully carried that on. That's good. Yeah. Very good. So this next one's a little bit drier. But your process when you've written your either short stories or novels, after you've written your first draft, what's your editing process?
Yeah. Oh, good question. I mean, I like that question. I'm an editor by day. I spend more of my time editing than I do writing. And unlike many writers, I really like the edit. I really like the second pass. I think I find first drafts not stressful exactly, but I do find them a bit breakneck. I feel like once started, I just want to get to the end, you know, the plot end, without really any faith that what I'm writing is worth anything. But by the end of the first draft, I think you often start to have interesting thought processes about what the book might really be about, especially thematically. The kind of superimposed interesting stuff that once written a book sort of evokes to you, and then in the second pass you double down on all of that and you try and draw it out much more. So I see
I like that way of describing it. That's really exciting because it means there's still an active creation happening actively as you're editing it.
Well, yeah, and it's the opposite of all the frustration of the first draft, where I just have constant crisis throughout. Past the halfway point of the first draft of a novel, it's just crisis all the way. Thinking, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what this is for anymore, but I'm determined to reach the end. Sort of almost as a purging, just like it's got to get out, and I don't want it in me anymore. like a sort of alien chest burster.
But then
with the second draft, that actually feels like making a novel, I think.
That's cool.
Whereas with short stories, it's quite different. And that's probably not all that contentious, I suppose, because I don't know about you guys, but usually with a short story, I have a pretty clear idea, not only of the plot, but also the purpose of a short story. So at the point of starting to write it, I'm rarely kind of winging it. And what that usually means is that my short story first drafts are almost... I always feel quite embarrassed by how complete they are. And I think the reason for the embarrassment is that it feels like laziness to not interrogate too much whether they could be different.
No, I understand that completely.
Yeah, and I think the difference is that with a short story, for whatever reason, it feels sort of instinctively more honest to just let it be the thing that was written more or less first time, and the thing that sort of conceived whilst sort of having a shower or poo or something. So my short stories, I often feel a bit sort of apologetic about them because I feel like I'm just sort of like, I write very quickly, so it might be 2 hours spent, usually first thing in the morning, which is when I do most of my writing, and then edited the next day for 1 hour, and that's it, and that's genuinely it. Maybe there'll be like a third pass, but it's really just typos and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And although I feel bad about that, it's like the evidence sort of conspires to make me even more uncertain, because the ones that often feel most sort of tossed off have sometimes done much better for themselves. They've been taken up by a publication more quickly, or they've been pulled out for a year's best or something like that. And there's no reason to it. So I no longer think that more time spent on a short story is necessarily going to help it.
I don't think you need to feel bad or embarrassed by that at all. I think that strongly gels with our experiences for writing for the bookcase.
Absolutely.
In fact, sometimes when I've spent too long editing something or rewriting it or whatever, it's very easy to overwrite a short story.
It's sort of funny how, because a novel obviously is more complex and it has threads and layers and all that sort of thing, that you can spend an almost infinite amount of time on a novel and still be improving it, I think. But yeah, I used to not really understand or feel like I understood short fiction. I still feel like I'm no expert, but I do like that immediacy. I like the idea that you just have a very clear sort of crystallized vision of something, and then you put it down, and then, for better or worse, there it is. You've sicked it up, and now someone can look at it if they want.
I love the idea of just vomiting a story.
This
a lot.
This actually makes me think quite strongly about George R. R. Martin, because he's primarily a short story writer who's now very, very famous as a fantasy novelist. But his books are structured with all the chapters as they're essentially short stories strung together. And they're obviously very good because he does very well with them, and I've enjoyed them in the past. But he does write himself into a corner by doing that, because he's just going with the flow, he's doing that short story writing thing, and being like, this would be good here, this would be good here, and that's why it takes 10 years for him to write the next one, because the trying to pull plot threads through that is almost impossible when you haven't written it at the scale of a novel. Whereas there's something sort of almost truer about writing a short story, in that you've got to convey meaning, you've got to convey character, all the things that you need to get into it in order for it to be a story has to be done very quickly and efficiently and concisely.
Yeah, and I think the process.
Please go on.
I think the process of treating chapters as effectively like short stories, I think that's a really strong way to approach work, and I think it can really avoid the sense of petering out, sort of trailing off. If you can sort of envisage the shape of a chapter or a sequence in the same way that you would a short story, then it's bound to be stronger. But I confess I've never read any George R.R. Martin, but like everyone, I watched Game of Thrones. And I had a real revelation watching that show, and presumably it applies to the novels as well. It was just that realization that such a huge proportion of individual scenes had only 2 people in. Is this like something that everyone points out, or is this?
I actually haven't heard that before, but now that you've said it, I can sort of see it.
Yeah, and I might be wrong, and maybe it was just like a certain episode I was watching, and I had what felt like a light bulb moment. But I'm kind of aloof to big battle scenes, that sort of thing. I mean, not really, but it's not really kind of my thing so much. But the kind of machinations, really into it. But yeah, so many of the scenes where 2 people are traveling together. They have to get to the other side of Westeros or whatever, and that means they're stuck together, and it's always odd. An odd couple, and they're bickering, and obviously with all those kind of like interspersed strands, maybe it was just certain episodes in the middle of a season or something like that, but you would just hop from bickering pair number 1 to bickering pair number 2 to bickering pair maybe with a maidservant in there in the mix, But yeah, effectively they were each of them sort of like chamber pieces, even if the setting would change.
I can definitely see that. I mean, just from the perspective of how the novels work, a great deal of the occurrences, the sort of the things that happen in the world happen in the negative space around the chapters. So you'll have characters reacting to something or kicking something off, and then that will have a cascade effect through the story. But then also a great amount of it happens internally with an internal monologue that all of the characters have. They all have a very strong thought voice in the story, and I think there is a great deal of just 2 people or 2 main characters in a scene talking. Potentially, that's just where his his dialogue and tension comes from in his writing. Maybe I think I could definitely see that. There are of course big feast scenes and big battle scenes and all the rest of it, but
to say if you didn't bring up the food.
the food is an enormous amount. It's like 30% of those books is descriptions of food.
And rivers.
Oh yeah, a little bit of river, yeah.
So we've just had a bit of an insight into Ben's, but when it comes to other authors, who inspires you?
Current authors or
contemporary authors would be a good way to go, I think.
Yeah, okay. Always when I've been asked this question in a lot of many recent years, my answer has been Aaliyah Whiteley. Who has she been on the show? I'm not sure she has.
Yes, she has. Sorry, episode 22. It was a really long time ago.
Right. Well, there you go. So yeah, she published originally with Unsung Stories, which sadly closed just last month. But they were publishing incredible weird fiction or slipstream fiction or unclassifiable fiction. And her first 2 novellas, The Beauty and The Arrival of Missives, just completely lit up my brain. And it was a point where I was just starting to try and write my own stuff. And as I say, I was writing not Doctor Who fan fiction, but John Wyndham fan fiction, essentially. And I realised that I wasn't reading anything that was written in the last 30 years. I'd stuck with the same sort of canon of authors, most of the men as well, frankly, but they were writing a long time ago. And and I went to the first fantasy con, and I strode up to the first table at my first fantasy con, which happened to be the Unsung Stories one, and I said, "Okay, what do I need to read here?" And I was pushed these two novellas, and it just when I read those books, it illustrated to me not only were people writing exactly the sort of thing that I love now, which I thought was a kind of weird science fiction that had died out, but it was kind of more heart racing and stranger than anything else. So that's my answer.
That's delightful. That's delightful. Yes. No, that was episode 22 with it was the prompt was toxic. Yeah, that was it. Yeah, it was in 2021. It was a really good episode. That.
Right. Yeah. Nowadays, I tend to read less genre fiction than I used to, but I do find myself being attracted to the kind of literary fiction where really they're writing genre fiction, but the publisher doesn't want people to, get wise to it. So the one of the last really amazing books I read that was published this year is a book called Biography of X by Catherine Lacey, which is a fictional biography of a sort of artist and protester and sort of Renaissance woman, but it's also this kind of alternate history about a version of the United States where the South seceded from the Union in the 1930s, and then you've got this 50-year history where the two parts of the United States have lived separately, and this woman's snuck out from the South. But yeah, and it's a big sort of metafictional novel that looks like a biography, and it's even got photos in it. But yeah,
that's great.
There's stuff like that has been published at the moment that you have to read reviews sort of with a keen eye to think, hold on, I think this is really a science fiction book, and that's what I tend to leap on at the moment.
Amazing.
I love the use of like meta text and sort of paratext in order to inform what the story is really about. It's such a strong thing to do, and I haven't really read much of it before, but I'll take your advice there, and I think I might take
anything which is fiction but has footnotes is like suddenly I'm excited by that. It's hard to explain.
I love a footnote.
Yeah, you're in Terry Pratchett fan country here, so we're very comfortable with a footnote.
So, have you ever associated a song or a piece of music with one of your characters? I'd be most interested, actually, if it happened to you with Dear Sherlock.
Sherlock is one of the So I don't associate music to my Sherlock novels actually, but I strongly associate music to all of my original books. They're my my own original fiction. And I go far on this. I go deep on this concept because I write music, and that's well and good. That's fine. And but I also, with novels, after the first draft, I create these sort of fictional soundtracks. Not fictional,
cool, yeah.
An imagined soundtrack to a film version, I guess. That sort of thing. And that sort of allocate themes to characters, and also kind of like develop the tone of books. That we're saying that point of like you've done a first draft and you realize the themes. It's become a useful shorthand for me to then have a Spotify soundtrack, which isn't just like a grab bag of stuff that I like, which is a bit in the right sort of vein. It's like a very specific 15 tracks. Really the definitive soundtrack, but also the sequence is very important. It's like a mixtape. And then the soundtrack is pretty much fixed at that point and becomes like sort of totemic in a way. That the book becomes like the soundtrack because you sort of have a glimpse of what it needs to be and then pin it down with the soundtrack, and then the second pass is to make it like that.
That's great. I think it's
really exciting that you put them on your website as well. Whenever you click on one of the books that you've done it for, it's down at the bottom, isn't it? The book soundtrack with the Spotify links.
Yeah, yes, they are there. I'd forgotten that. I
Yes.
don't think anybody clicks on them, and that's it's absolutely fine. But it
I can
feels
tell you, I've clicked on it today. So
okay. Well, there's one.
yeah.
But yeah, it feels really, really important to me, and I completely accept that it's not important to other writers for their work or to other readers for my work, and why should it be? But yeah, it's funny that on my website it has all of the covers of the books, but it's kind of like a sort of synesthetic response now that if I look at the books, I hear parts of the music.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's funny, but yeah, it's oddly important and stupidly trivial at the same time.
Well, I mean, I think for Nico is also a musician as well, and I think you've spoken about it before that it's an integral part of the process for you is to be listening to the right kind of music whilst you're creating and associating it with. I do it sometimes as well, and I like it.
It's really funny to me as well. Like I had it with writing this the piece from last episode, where I had a sort of like ambient sci-fi playlist on, and then all of a sudden it went din 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 din. I was like, I cannot write this story to the fucking Terminator theme. I actually just can't. So all of a sudden, Mother kicked her way out of the console and started blowing people away. It's just not the vibe.
Oh, fantastic.
But if you do want to, I've only written a car chase once, and I remember very carefully picking the music I needed to listen to write it, because I don't think I was really capable of raising my heart rate enough on my own volition. So yeah, it can really work, but you're right, it shouldn't be accidental. It's frustrating if the music leads you rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
So when you are writing and potentially listening to music, if writing chase sequences and stuff, what tropes do you actively steer away from in your writing that feel like pitfall, like traps?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm tempted to say, like, if I knew of them, then I mean, I don't know the tropes, but I know they're there.
Yeah, they're noted by their absence, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean the word tropes, I guess it can apply at different levels, can't it? So I do feel that on a sentence level, I know there are habits I slip into, I think just like anyone does. And so I'm conscious enough of those and I avoid those, starting with sort of unnecessary adjectival bits and bobs, just like padding. But at a plot level, I've kind of got to a place where I sort of welcome returning to the same ideas, because I feel like if your brain keeps pushing you in a certain place, then maybe that's just your thing, So I've written my document of notes of things I could write. There's tons of stuff there about identity, people sort of like losing their identity or being concerned about losing their identity, that sort of thing. And I'd roll my eyes when I start writing, especially a story, and then you realize you're returning to that same ground of someone sort of like feeling like they're not themselves or they're worried that they're going to change, that sort of thing. So the first novel I had published in mainstream publishing was Snakeskins, and that's about the idea that every 7 years the people in the novel shed their skin, which is scientifically that's what we do. All our cells replace every 7 years, but they do it more literally, and they produce a snakeskin, which is like a doppelganger, and that snakeskin walks around and talks and has all the same memories, but lasts only for maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe a year.
I really like that concept. Sorry, go on.
Right, yeah, and to me, it's kind of like it's sort of, it's fascinating, but it's also kind of horrific. And the main horror for me is if you to put yourself in the person who generates the snakeskin, who will continue to live. So there's a horror from the other side, which is that person knows they're going to die, just evaporate within a week or whatever. But from the first person's point of view, the fear is, what if that other one is a better version of me than I am? And that's more the kind of horror, like the just internal fear that I find most interesting.
And like doubt-based horror. That's
doubt-based.
Makes my anxiety hurt. Thank you.
I think that's my whole. All my work is doubt-based horror. I think you've nailed it. So even in the Sherlock Holmes stories, because they're novels and they're longer than all of the Sherlock Holmes novels and everything in the canon, then you have more room to play with stuff. And I've been most interested in playing with the character of Watson. And when you go deep into that character, for me, it's all about his doubts that he's useful to Sherlock Holmes, his doubts that he's even necessary, but also because he is the writer of everything that we read about Sherlock Holmes, then his doubts about whether he's doing a good enough job of that is, I think, really key. But yeah, so it feels like, so even with something as familiar as Sherlock Holmes, I think that you've nailed it, that I end up talking about doubt and identity. So that is a trope, and I would understand someone being quite critical that I'm just skirting around the same thing again and again. And I think, well, that's okay.
I like that. I think that there is a degree of writing proactively and positively that you've built deep into your approach to writing, which is extremely admirable and certainly inspiring. Because you could spend quite a lot of time being like, oh no, have I fridged somebody? Have I, is this a epic quest that this young boy was prophesized for or whatever? But, sometimes it doesn't bloody matter, does it? Like, you just write the story that you've got.
There wouldn't be tropes if there weren't at least a foundation of great stories using that, would they?
I think so.
Yeah, it's true. And, we can all kind of be critical of the chosen one narrative, and I feel like that too. But having said that, I think if you were writing and that's where it takes you, there's probably a good reason for it, and probably it's buried fairly subconsciously. And I think as long as you're aware and you constantly sort of interrogate, does this feel necessary? Then I think while they may be traps, you should still be open to the traps, because that might still be the right answer. Fall into the trap.
Oh, getting taught things here. This is great.
Been properly schooled, mate.
Yeah. So, what's your next project? I know you've got Jekyll and Hyde Consulting Detectives coming out in 2024, but do you already have stuff on the burner?
Yes, I'm writing a lot at the moment. Preparing with fingers crossed more Jekyll and Hyde, hoping that would generate more, but that's far from a certainty. But yeah, so I've written a couple of big, very strange novels that I think are going to be in gestation for a good while yet. But because of the sort of inherent frustration of long lead times of publishing and that sort of thing, I've been writing a lot of short fiction recently. And actually, helpfully, that was the same headspace that got me to write the story for this podcast. I'm writing a collection of theme stories about great robots of history.
Oh, cool!
Of which Talos is a great example. And that's actually the second Talos story I've written, because he's such an interesting character. But yeah, so I'm writing this collection of short stories about robots throughout history, but of course few of them are really what we would call robots, and some of them aren't robots at all. But there's really strange pockets of history, like René Descartes, the philosopher, apparently, maybe apocryphally, built a replica of his young daughter who died, that was a working automaton, and then took it everywhere with him. I don't know if that's true. Yeah.
It sounds fantastical, doesn't it, to have actually happened? But
to me, that sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
It's incredible,
but a wonderful starting point for your story.
Yeah. And so I'm writing a lot of stories about interesting stuff like that, like when Julius Caesar was stabbed by I think 23 senators. An effigy of his body was displayed to the crowd by Mark Antony, and it was a moving automaton that turned above the crowd and revealed his 23 wounds to the crowd in order to inspire a riot. And again, it's arguably not a robot, but it makes for a fantastic jumping off point. So
I really thought you were going to say that Brutus et al. Had been in a big mech suit or something. Like Power Rangers taking down Julius Caesar.
Senator Mech.
I mean, those weren't the narrative decisions I took, but actually, now that you say that, there's scope for another one here.
Are we going for a Gundam Roman Republic?
Hell yeah.
So yeah, it's been very satisfying. This idea, writing short stories, I think is a lovely thing to be doing. Especially, last year I wrote 4 novels, and I think no short stories. And so to turn the dial the other way has been lovely, but also to feel like, because they're all themed, you're building one thing that's concrete and possibly is a book.
It really sounds like no rest for the wicked over at your place.
I get very, very antsy when I'm not writing, and novels are so lengthy, but also the queue for them is very lengthy as well, to go through the various processes.
Yeah.
And sensibly, you have to slow down at some point. There's not many writers that can be publishing 3 or 4 things a year. Although I have been writing commission things recently, so that's an outlet. But yeah, I write. I don't write every day, but I like writing. And
in the morning when you wake up, that's the point, is it?
Yeah. I'm freelance anyway, so the desk where I write is the same desk where I do my work, and I sort of flip from one to the other when I want. But yeah, I think writing when you're still sleepy and unshowered, and everything is, for me, that's what really does it, because you don't tend to question your first draft or your impulses or anything like that. You're so sleepy, you just think, I don't even know if I'm even here.
Just unfiltered. Wonderful.
Yeah, and as I say, second draft, you can tidy that
up. So, obviously, you've been a fantastic guest. I cannot say that strongly enough. I want to keep up with what you do after today, and I promise I won't spam you with emails. So, where can I and the other people go to keep up to date with what you're doing?
Well, the simplest way is to go to the website I mentioned earlier, www.timjmajor.com, and there on the homepage, underneath my not smiling face, but sort of like passive face, there's a link to subscribe to my newsletter. And as you said earlier, that newsletter includes not only my news, but it also has prompts for short story opportunities. Sorry, not prompts. Short story opportunities for writers, and so hopefully is a useful resource as well as me, bragging.
And you're also at Tim J Major on Twitter, Instagram.
Yes.
And do you do Facebook as well, or
just
Insta?
Only between for friends, so not so much that.
Yeah, that's fair. Oh yeah, well I will fully and wholeheartedly endorse exactly what Nico said, which is this has been a tour de force. I hope you don't mind us guinea pigging the new questions on you. I felt like they really led us to an interesting place, but that might just be because you're interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, it felt like I can't remember how we got to where we got, but so there must have been. But yeah, thank you so much. This has been so much fun, and it's all been new to me. The whole setup, which has been wonderful.
Fantastic. Well, you can. Everyone listening can go and grab And the House Lights Dim by Tim Major. That's the short story collection that he's recommended that's the starting point. But also Snakeskins and Hope Island and the Sherlock Holmes novels and in the future the Jekyll and Hyde books, which we hope will be a series, and robots. So do get his work, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you for your time. Say thank you, aliens. Thank you, aliens.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates.
Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The tiny bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La, How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?